So today's lecture is going to be on neurobiological foundations for psychiatric nursing. Our objectives today are going to be applying knowledge about the structure of the brain, but also how it functions as it relates to psychiatric nursing practice. We're going to assess the impact of sleep and the circadian rhythm on an individual's mood and abilities. Then understanding the impact that genetics can have on mental illness, and then assessing patients from a neurobiological perspective. Some important concepts to remember, or points to remember, include the idea that the human thoughts, feelings, and action begin right in the nervous system. The brain actually weighs 3 to 5 pounds and contains billions and billions of neurons that are responsible for the transmission of information and the function of the brain. The brain is really the most complex and it is the most vital human organ, as it's responsible for making sure that each individual system within the body functions the way that it should. There are a few ways in which mental illness can present itself. These alterations include brain neuron malfunction, destructions of those neurons, or an alteration in their connection between your brain regions. When we think about the cellular composition, we have to remember that there are billions and billions of neurons, and their job is collecting and conducting electrical pulses. And these electrical pulses end up releasing these neurotransmitters, which are chemical substances that open and close channels as they function within their role as a neural messenger. Between the function of the brain, the regulating of BP, to the conscious sense of ourselves, results from that action of individual neurons and interconnections between them. So when we start to look at this cerebrum, we're looking at that largest part of the brain that has two different hemispheres. You have your left and you have your right. 95% of people have that dominance with that left hemisphere. And that left hemisphere really controls the right side of the body, the speech, the comprehension, rationality, and logic. The right hemisphere, dominant 5% of people, that's where that creative brain comes. That portion of that right side, right hemisphere, actually controls not only our creativity, but also our affect, our behavior, and that spatial perception that we have. When we look deeper into the cerebrum, there's the corpus callosum, and that connects both those hemispheres together. There's a large bundle of white matter that continues to grow in size up to the age of about 21 to 24 years of age, and it helps coordinate that human activity, but it also contributes to the ability to engage in problem solving. It's from the cerebral cortex that you'll find a thin layer of gray matter, and that makes up the surface of both those hemispheres. Much of our behavior, or what makes us as human beings, stems from this area. So what you will see is sensation, speech, thinking, voluntary motor function, and perception. Now, when we look into each hemisphere, we're going to be looking at different aspects. Those aspects include the 4 lobes. You have your frontal lobe, which is your largest lobe, your parietal lobe, which is where the processing center is, your temporal lobe, that helps with your emotions, and your occipital lobe is your perception and your recognition. So let's look at them a little bit deeper. With your frontal lobe, this is really the chief administrator of the brain. So with that large lobe, again, what makes us who we are, that's what stems from this area. Our ability to engage in planning, problem solving, our ability to bring back and recall memories that we have, our concentration, our behavior, our ability to put things into sequence, making meaning of language, and like our organization of our speech. our emotional responses. This all stems from this area. And if you can see, there's a lot of information there to have to, for your brain to have to be able to process or engage in, which makes it considerable that the front lobe will be your largest area here. So what happens when you have damage to that frontal lobe? When we think about what the brain is capable of doing, damage to that frontal lobe can undo that. So it can create fear and aggression, rage or euphoria. No longer can you be able to maintain focus, so you end up being distracted, having a poor attention span, not lacking feeling, which is what apathy is, and you might want to write that down, or emotional blunting, so you don't see that affect. It becomes flat, and then they have an inability to plan ahead, because that's that process that happens in that section of the brain. With your cerebral cortex structure, other things that you'll see, again, the temporal lobe. So we talked about the frontal, we're moving on. This is where your Wernicke area is, and this is where your patient and you yourself get that ability to have speech. You're able to recognize written, verbal, and visual speech as well. Emotions. This comes from here. Impulse and aggressive control. The ability to have sexual actions and meanings and be able to understand that. That comes from this space within our brains. In the temporal lobe, if that temporal lobe is damaged, then you see the opposite again. Disorders of learning and memory. That ability to speak. They have aphasia. So they're not able to interpret the language anymore. They're unable to learn new information. When it comes to their emotions, they have anger, rage, fear, anxiety, panic. Now, I want you to think about this, because as we go through this lecture and as we start putting this together with different mental illnesses, when you realize that certain mental illnesses are connected with certain portions of our brain or have an effect on certain portions of our brain, then we can make the connection as to what our patients can and will be able to do and what they're not capable of doing, which is why we have to change our teaching. Next, we have the parietal lobe, which is that processing center where our perceptions and interpretations of sensory information are put together, our spatial awareness, our bodily awareness, those filters of all that noise that we don't want to hear, how we address ourselves, read a map, follow directions, all that processing of information from that left hemisphere, that's where all of this happens. But unfortunately, there are times when there can be damage to the parietal lobe. And that damage to the parietal lobe causes a loss of sensation on that opposite side of the body, depending on where their damage or lesion is found. That individual is not able to identify objects by touch. They lose the ability to understand language spoken by others, but they may be able to talk, but really not understand. What's important to understand about that parietal lobe is that damage to that area really damages their ability to have that sensory function. It really does not affect their ability to perceive sensory input. And so we take all of that into consideration and making sure that when we're working with our patients that we're considerate of them when we're approaching them as well. The occipital lobe is that perception and recognition, where we receive information that we get through our eyes or from our eyes. So that depth perception, that color recognition, how to look at an object and be able to say what it is and name it, how we are able to track things with our eyes. However, when trauma happens or if there's lack of oxygen, then that individual will result in having visual deficits or can be blind or have visual hallucinations. The basal ganglia can be found beneath the frontal cortex. And so there's a lot of connections that you're going to see there between the cortex and the midbrain, in which our body uses that, or our brain uses that for learning and programming information. Now, some of it can be automatic, such as walking and eating or driving. Others can be that role that fundamental role that we have in cognition, that ability to think. When there's damage, you'll see individuals present with diagnosis such as Parkinson's disease, because they have that dopamine level is affected. Huntington, they'll see that with the GABA and acetylcholine levels. And in other illogical and loose associations related to schizophrenia, you'll see that within your patient. The limbic system is very important to us. This is where you'll find the amygdala. That's that motherboard. The limbic system is all about the emotional functioning. So it modulates our anger and our aggression. It determines our move to fight or flight. It puts emotions to certain responses that we have. It's responsible for that sexual arousal and aggression. Research also says that there's some biological foundation to individuals who may have bipolar disorder, that maybe that limbic system is involved there. Another part of the limbic system includes the thalamus. This is the brain's computer that helps relay information, sensory information, filter out information, to prevent the cortex from going into overload. Again, that incoming information includes those emotions, the moods, the memories. It regulates our level of awareness as well. Now, when there's a dysfunction, you will see difficulty integrating the sensory stimuli, so they may go into sensory overload. Again, with hyper or hypersensitivity to pain, they may be unable to differentiate if something is or isn't pleasurable. And they can have difficulty really staying in the present, so they lose that focus. With the hypothalamus, this is about your survival functions of yourself. This is where the regulation of the need to take in food and fluids, the regulation of the body temperature, the regulation of sleep, the control center for your pituitary and your autonomic nervous system. These are millions of connections throughout the brain that happen here. When there is a dysfunction, you're going to see the opposite. So they're going to have deficits related to maybe poor nutrition, an inability to sleep. They may have problems with depression. You're going to see mood changes. They may have SAD, which is that seasonal affective disorder. Issues with being able to regulate their temperature, especially you'll see that with patients with schizophrenia and them wearing inappropriate clothing. And so again, what am I going to be thinking about? Caution with individuals who may have this type of deficit. They may have eating disorders, difficulty expressing their emotions, difficulty again with sleep pattern, and difficulty with sexual functions. With the hippocampus, this is the library. This is where all the directions, everything it is that we need, our recall for memory, with laughter and tears, how we transfer information, short-term and long-term. This is where all of this is stored. When there is psychosis involved, it's harder for the individuals to store and retrieve that information in their short-term memory. They have a deficit in their verbal memory. Their recall is going to be difficult, especially when their anxiety is high. And when it comes to traumatic events, they're going to be stored in pictures and feelings, not really language. And so you may even see where patients are in their notes, in their charts, having signs of dissociative symptoms. With the circadian rhythm, this is our internal clock that coordinates our events and what happens within our body over a 24-hour period. The time it takes actually for the Earth to actually spin on its axis. So that transition between light, darkness, and temperature, all that happens within this rhythm. There is other aspects that play along with that circadian rhythm that includes our body's ability to move fluid, perfuse tissues. It affects our mental abilities and moods, and can vary depending on the time of day from one moment to another. When it comes to sunlight becomes that cue as an external factor that synchronizes and creates rhythms within us that says, hey, it's time to get up. And I know that I say sunlight, but that sunlight can be recreated by any kind of light. But if you have that light, it's usually a cue for us to say, you know what, it's time to get up and go. What happens is that light enters into that retina. It creates a pathway to the hypothalamus, and then it creates a response within that retina and creates a pacemaker for our circadian rhythm. So our body starts creating this internal clock based on the external environment. So earlier we talked about that biological clock that we all have that regulates that circadian rhythm, and that is located within your suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is an area of that hypothalamus that lies just on top of the optic chiasm. And it is said to that with everything, including our cells, our tissues, and our bodies, they work off this clock. So there's this sending of electrical and chemical messages between the brain and other glands and organs, sending hormonal messages not only to the heart, but the adrenal glands, the liver, the kidneys, and the intestines to kind of help keep our body into this rhythm. When it comes to sleep, the sleep cycle is usually 6 to 9 hours a night. And it's timed throughout that circadian rhythm. Our body recognizes the changes between light and darkness, and also recognizes those temperature changes as well. So with your stages of sleep, you're going to have stage 1, which is just falling asleep. That's just it. And stage 2, that's that sleep itself, and 50% of that 6 to 9 sleep hour time is actually spent there. Stage 3 and 4 is that really good deep sleep that we all want, that delta sleep, and we stay there only 15% of that sleeping time. The first half of that is really just our sleep period. And then you get to stage 5, and that's when you'll see REM. They'll have that rapid eye movement. 20 to 25% of our sleep time is here as well. That's where you'll start to get those vivid dreams. And then because of those vivid dreams, you'll start to see those that rapid eye movement within people. In stages 2 through 5, you're going to go through this several times. Then patients, individuals, they go through this several times throughout the night. Deep sleep becomes briefer, and then REM, you stay there a little bit longer. And optimally, people are healthier if they can progress through the normal stages of sleep each night. When we think about mental illness, there is a genetic component that goes along with it. And there's some genetic investigations that show that there's a familial and a genetic factor that underlies a lot of the psychiatric mental illnesses that individuals may have. And it involves some genes and other mechanisms related to gene expression. What I also want to make sure that it's important for you guys to realize, and just an understatement, that when we talk about those neurotransmitters and how they have their effect on mood and depression, that there are several ones that you're going to hear throughout. They include your acetylcholine, your glutamate, your GABA, your serotonin, your dopamine, and your norepinephrine. These are going to be your different neurotransmitters. And again, what is also important to remember is that medication can affect that, and that you'll see a lot of the times with individuals with a psychiatric mental illness, that their sleep is involved. So a lot of the times when you're dealing with your patient and you're doing your admission, you're thinking of a couple of things. You're thinking about whether or not your patient has been getting enough sleep. But just before that, you're going to be looking at too, are you on any new medications that could be affecting not only your sleep pattern, but your neurotransmitters? Are they affecting that serotonin, that dopamine, that GABA, that glutamate? You're going to be looking at all those. And that brings us to the end of our lecture.